The number of children with disabilities globally is estimated at almost 240 million. This is according to a new UNICEF report, which has found that children with disabilities are more disadvantaged compared to children without disabilities on most measures of child well-being. The report includes internationally comparable data from 42 countries and covers more than 60 indicators of child well-being, from nutrition to education. These indicators are aggregated by functional difficulty type and severity, child sex, economic status and country. The report makes clear the barriers children with disabilities face to participating fully in their societies and how this often translates to negative health and social outcomes. For more on the report, we're now joined by Claudia Cappa, UNICEF's senior advisor and lead author of this report. Claudia, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Thank you.
How was the report compiled and how much ground did it cover?
The report has been compiled over the last 5 years. We have been gathering data from National Statistical Office across the world, and we have been able to report on 6 indicators of well-being, as you mentioned, using data from different countries in the world.
Now, do expand for us, if you can, Claudia, on the multiple barriers faced by children with disabilities.
There are different barriers. First of all, physical barriers. We still have stairs, which create an impediment to children with wheelchair, for instance, to be able to access schools. But we also have communication barriers. Sometimes we are unable to respond to the needs of children who cannot see. And lastly, we have barriers that are of cultural nature. There is stigma and discriminations against children with disabilities. And for us to be able to create inclusive societies, we have to break down all these barriers and we have to stop building new ones.
And in terms of gender, does the report detail how boys and girls living with disabilities are affected?
Absolutely. The report includes statistics that are disaggregated depending on whether the child is a boy or a girl. And when it comes to girls, there is a compounding effect of discrimination that girls face with respect to many different aspects of their well-being. For instance, girls with disability are twice as likely to feel discriminated.
Now, Claudia, when we look at access to education, the report shows that a large number of children living with disabilities continue to be left behind. I mean, is it a question of governments not building enough schools or facilities dedicated to children living with disabilities or children with special needs? Or is it perhaps a question of the numbers of children living with disabilities being too little, perhaps, for governments to accommodate them?
Well, 240 million, this is not a small number. It's a significant number.
Yes.
And regardless of the size of the number, every single child, including children with disability, have the right to an education. And children with disability needs to be able to be in schools that are inclusive, learning together with their peers without disabilities. It's about building inclusive schools. It's about building inclusive curricula. It's about erasing the cultural barriers that I mentioned earlier, because sometimes even teachers, they carry stigma and discrimination against children with disabilities.
Should it be made mandatory on the part of governments, in particular the education departments, to make the schools inclusionary in terms of building more facilities that will accommodate children living with disabilities?
Absolutely. Again, children with disabilities have the same rights as every other child to access to education, to be able to enjoy the school's facilities, for instance, including the playground. They have the right to be accommodated in all their different learning needs.
And then in terms of the social workers and the caretakers, should it be the government's responsibility or should it be the families of the children living with disabilities?
Well, it's everybody's responsibilities.
Yeah.
Because the governments have the responsibility to provide support to the families of children with disabilities. And of course, families of children with disabilities, they have an important role to play, but it is everybody's responsibility, and it starts with every single one of us.
And what are the report's recommendations? What is it that the report is recommending? I mean, you just said that it is everybody's responsibility. Could it be, the parents, the families, community members, including the government itself? So what does the report recommend that the government should do in terms of enforcing, the responsibility on the part of everybody to ensure that the rights of children living with disabilities are respected?
First of all, we need to create inclusive services. And I'm talking about health services, I'm talking about education services. They have to be inclusive. We also have to make sure that children with disabilities and all children are protected against violence, exploitation, and abuse. Children with disabilities also need to receive special assistance in the forms, for instance, of social protection. And we have to eradicate the barriers that exist in the environment and stop creating new ones. As I mentioned, there are physical barriers, there are communication barriers, there are cultural barriers. So again, it's the responsibility of everybody, including the media, to make sure that we do not continue to disseminate erroneous perceptions and stigma around children with disabilities.
Claudia, we are aware that there are, two types of children living with disabilities. A, the ones who were born with a particular disability, and then B, the ones who've had or who've been afflicted with a certain disability as a result of an incident of some sort. And you find that the latter, the parents are not well capacitated to look after their children living with disabilities as a result of an accident or any other incident of some sort. Do you get a sense then that parents are mentally and as well as physically capacitated to look after the children living with disabilities?
What really matters is the environment, is the type of access children and family with disabilities have. What makes a child disabled is not his or own physical or mental impairment, but it's the environment that creates the disabilities. Because in environments that are accommodating, that are responsive to the need of all children, including children with disability, a child with an impairment is still able to go to school and participate. So that's why it goes back to everybody's responsibilities, because it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that families are supported. It's the responsibility of the school system to make sure that teachers are prepared and there are no physical or communication barriers. It's the responsibility of parents as well to make sure that they treat all of their children in the same manners.
So how then does the government discharge its responsibility to take care of the rights and the needs of children living with disabilities, seeing that there is a lack of legislation available for protecting and promoting the rights of children with disabilities?
Sometimes it's the lack of legislation. In other cases, it's a very poor social protection mechanism, because it is indeed a reality that family of children with disabilities needs financial support or other forms of assistance because their needs might be greater, but also because sometimes disability goes together with poverty. So it is the responsibility of government to make sure that families have support through social protection mechanisms that will allow them to face this additional cost. And this is particularly relevant in times of crisis, like the pandemic that we are living today, where families have a lot of economic distress. And this is particularly the case for families in vulnerable positions. So this is, again, the responsibility of governments to make sure that families do not have to immediately feel the impact of crisis like the one we are going through today.
Claudia, there's the issue of wording and, referencing, in reference to children with disabilities. There's this misconception of calling those children disabled children. And I found that very disparaging and misguided, because it suggests that they cannot do anything. They are disabled. They are not able to do anything, yet they are only afflicted with a certain and a particular disability. They are only able to do the other, the other movements or the other, things that they can do in their daily lives. So Whose responsibility is it to educate the masses on the proper referencing and wording in reference to children living with disabilities?
Well, I feel like I'm repeating in a way myself, but it's everybody's responsibility. And of course, the media has a very, very important role to play.
Right.
Let's try to avoid stigmatizing language. Let's try to stop using words like disabled child. Let's try to stop using expression like living with a disability. Disability, again, is a creation of the environment. There are children with different characteristics, children with different impairments, but accommodating societies are able to respond to the needs of these children so that the impairment doesn't become a reason for not participation, because a child does not participate if the environment does not let every single child be able to participate.
All right, Claudia, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me.